I see so many people making the same exposure mistakes again and again, and I've been guilty of it myself in the past, because the thing is, it can get quite confusing and there's a lot of conflicting information and false information out there. But the thing is, not setting your exposure properly will make it so much harder to get the image you always dreamed of, and your videos could end up looking like a budget movie that never made it to the cinema, or even DVD. This is why it's so important to avoid these 7 mistakes and to understand exposure so that you can get the most professional looking shots straight out of camera every single time, because a great image starts before you even press record. So by the time you finish watching this video, you'll be much more confident in your camera abilities. Now I've got a few introductory videos about exposure where I go in depth on the camera settings and reading the exposure meter within your camera, so I'll leave links to those at the end of this video or in the description below. The first mistake leads to inconsistency across scenes, videos, or styles, but especially when using more than one camera. Each shot is going to look different and it's going to be distracting for the viewers. And this usually happens because you're being lazy. Now I get it, because that was me. I just wanted to get on with it, work as fast as possible and get the job done, but then I'm annoyed with myself when I look back at the footage because I didn't take the time to set things up properly, and now my image is suffering. Now, as boring as it sounds, using the in-camera tools or external tools like a grey card or a colour checker can be so helpful. Now, I know it seems really annoying to have to think about this extra stuff, but using tools like this actually save you time in the long run, as well as helping you get more professional and consistent results. Let me quickly show you a few of my favourite tools and how to use them. If you're a beginner and you're a bit worried that it might be too complex, don't worry, because they're actually a lot simpler than people make it out to be. And trust me, if I'm using them, they must be easy. Now, a lot of people use the wide or multi-metering mode within their camera, and that measures the whole scene and gives you an exposure reading for the whole image. But this isn't the most accurate and it's often wrong. Plus, it doesn't give you the most flexibility. So instead, I like to use the spot metering mode. And the Lumix also has an additional luminance spot meter, so you can move these points around and get meter readings for more than one subject or area at the same time. Then I like to use a grey card. Jeez, wow, that's powerful. That's, yeah, probably not going to sell many of these now. Anyway, these little pop-up grey cards are really affordable. I'll leave a link in the description to those. Highly recommend. All you need to do is place this where your subject is going to be, or wherever you want to measure the exposure, and then make sure your exposure meter in the camera reads 0 when it's pointing at this. And this is going to make sure that everything else is exposed correctly in relation to this, because this is middle grey. Now, I explain more about that in this video here. Now, right, nerd alert, I'm sorry, I just need to point something out. Now, it's worth noting that most cameras are calibrated so that middle grey reads 0 on your exposure meter. But some camera brands are calibrated slightly differently depending on what picture profiles you're using. So it might be worth just looking at the manufacturer's website to figure out where the middle point sits with your camera. Another thing I like to do that really helps, and it's super easy, you don't really have to measure anything or do anything. If you're filming in a log profile, it can look a little bit flat and the shadows look a lot brighter than they actually are before you put your conversion LUT on. So it's important to use a monitoring LUT. Most cameras have these nowadays. If you've got an external monitor, you can upload LUTs to that depending on what monitor you've got. But that's going to give you a more accurate representation of what your colors and your contrast and your exposure looks like. So if you don't like any tools and you don't want to use anything, at least just do that one thing, because it's going to help you see a lot better what it's going to look like on your monitor a little bit more accurately, and that's going to make a massive difference. Now, there are other tools like zebras and false color, but I'm going to go into those more in depth in another video, so make sure you subscribe and hit the bell, because that'll be coming soon. This next one is more of a precaution really, and it's very subjective. And because it's quite common advice, everyone is using it all the time, and it doesn't work in every scenario because it's a tip for a very specific situation, and it gives you a very different look. There's a lot less contrast and a lot less saturation. That also means your color grading approach is going to change drastically. Now, I'm not saying don't use it, I'm not saying it's not a good technique, but rather experiment, see which version you prefer, and use it only when you need to. When cameras weren't as good in low light, you used to get a lot of noise in the shadows, so people started advising to overexpose by 1, 2, or even 3 stops to lift those shadows up and bring more detail out, meaning that middle grey would read +3. So let me just give an example of what that would look like. Hang on. There we go. That's +3. And then you would bring it down in post. And that's great. So then you get less noise. But since cameras are a lot better nowadays, a lot better dynamic range, and the sensors handle low light a lot better, we don't really need to use that. Plus, you actually get less dynamic range because when you change the middle point of the dynamic range by raising the exposure, you're actually reducing the amount of dynamic range in the highlights. So if you overexpose by 2 or 3 stops outside, any bright areas are going to be way overexposed and it's just going to look terrible, really. If you look at this shot here, because I've had to bring down the exposure so much of the highlights, it's causing us to have less contrast, but also you're losing the details in the background. If you look at the plant in the background when it's exposed at 0, you can see the detail, whereas when it's overexposed and you bring the highlights down, that plant almost disappears into the shadows and the image is a lot more flat. Now, it looks fairly nice, but just be careful. You're trading one thing for another. So I'm going to show you a better method in mistake number 6. So try and stick to middle grey being 0 wherever possible. Mistake number 3 means you actually have less flexibility within your camera. You can actually get more out of it than you think. So if you don't have access to much light, you're in a dark area, and you're using the widest aperture you can on your lens, you might feel a little bit stuck because that's as far as you can go and you just accept it for what it is. That's as bright as I can get the image. Well, don't be scared of raising the ISO. I know people say leave it as low as possible, and that's true, but cameras are so much better now than they used to be even about 4 years ago. And more than that, if you're lucky enough to have a camera that's got dual native ISO, like the Lumix S5 Mark II for example, you can bump the ISO up to 4000 and get a really clean image, even if you're using a slower lens at something like f5, and you're going to get plenty of brightness in your scene. If your indoor shots look amateur but you're not quite sure why, it could be because you're making this next mistake. So look at this shot. It looks okay, but something is distracting. The window is way too bright and we're losing some contrast in parts of the image like the blinds, the back wall, and it's like there's a little glow around me which I don't like. Now in this instance I expose for the subject, or me, but the light coming through the window is way too bright. So the mistake is people think that using an ND filter is only for when you're outside. But the thing is, the window and the sky is actually part of this image, so we need to control the brightness of it. Now the best thing I ever learned when it came to videography was to expose for what you can't control. Anything like the sky or natural light or lamps that you can't control the brightness of. So if there's anything like that in your shot, just use an ND filter and then add light to bring your subject up to the correct exposure. Now I've got loads more detail in the window and it looks like the camera's got more dynamic range. Now this is quite a common mistake and it leads to your overall image looking brighter or darker than you want it to be. When you see this, something's distracting and puts you off but you're not quite sure why. And that's because people often set the exposure for the subject but forget about the background. So you may think you've got perfect exposure, but you need to set or control the rest of the image as well. And often people's backgrounds are either way too dark or way too bright if they're using lights in the background but without dialing in the brightness of that light. And it happens a lot with neon signs and things like that because you can't obviously control those. And that's where you use the advice from the previous step. So you can either use a spot meter to measure the exposure between the subject and the background, or you can just use your eye and adjust the lights in the background to where you think it looks best and it's not distracting anymore. Basically, if you look at the image and your eye is pulled towards the lights in the background, it's too bright. You want to make sure that the subject is the thing that you're focusing on, unless you want to direct the attention to the background. So test a few variations to see which one you prefer and make sure it's not distracting, basically. No, I don't want pizza. I've had 2 pizzas in a row. Mistake number 6 is if you're filming at nighttime, but it's way too dark and it lacks detail. You might think that that's how something should be because it's nighttime, it's gonna be dark. But if you watch a lot of horror or thriller films, a lot of it is filmed at night, but you can still see detail in the shadows. You don't want everything to look black because you wouldn't have a sense of the space and you wouldn't be able to see the expressions on the characters' faces or any action. You actually need more light than you think, even if you want it to look dark. You need to kind of create the illusion of it looking dark. It's the way you light it that makes a difference. For example, they'll have the curtains open so the moonlight is coming through, or they'll use practical lights like lamps and TV to illuminate the space. Even if it's meant to be a shot in complete darkness with no light sources, we still need to see what's going on. So they'll often bounce light off the ceiling or rig up a light overhead or an entire panel just to give it a little bit of detail and light into those shadowy areas so you can still see what's happening. Okay, so this last mistake can ruin the entire intent of your videos completely. All of these shots have varying degrees of brightness, but they're all well exposed. They're just different. And that's the takeaway for this whole thing. There's no right or wrong. Yes, you can overexpose an image to the point where it's way too bright and it's distracting, or underexposed so you can't see anything, but it all comes down to the mood you want to portray. Perfect exposure isn't always perfect exposure. You might want something to look slightly underexposed and a little bit darker, and that's okay. So you have to light the frame in the way that best complements the mood that you're going for. There's no one rule that fits all. Just use your brain, switch on your melon, and ask yourself, how do I want it to look? And then just go with that. Follow the advice. You need to know how to control the camera settings so you can get to where you need to be. But other than that, do it how you want to do it. And use references. Have a look at some films or adverts or music videos, whatever it is, and try and get close to that. Look at every part of the frame and think, oh, that bit looks nice, or that bit looks a bit overexposed, I don't like that, blah, 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 and all that stuff. And you just do it how you know, take from that what you will. So this is all only one part of the puzzle when it comes to a professional image. If you really want to take your cinematography to the next level and blow your viewers away, you have to think about one other thing before pressing record, because without it, you won't be able to get the colors you truly want, and you'll spend even longer in post trying to fix things. And that's why you should watch this video next, because it's going to take what you've just learned and make it 10 times more powerful.